Everyone in town thought Walter Briggs was just a cranky old man who kept to himself. They whispered about the weird guy with the dogs at the edge of town, the one who never came to barbecues, who never waved at the mailman, who rarely left his 5-acre property unless it was to pick up supplies. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, is that Walter Briggs had once led a team into the most dangerous war zones in the world and walked out alive more times than anyone had a right to. His hands, now weathered and rough from soil and sun, had once been steady enough to defuse bombs and pull wounded brothers in arms out of burning wrecks. The quiet of his life wasn't isolation, it was earned peace. Walter didn't hang flags or wear his service on his sleeve. His medals, his commendations, even the letter from the president, those were kept in a box under the floorboards, not out of shame, out of humility. He hadn't served for recognition. He served because it was right. But after 30 years, 4 tours, and 2 nearly fatal injuries, he wanted nothing more than to be forgotten by the world he had once been willing to die for. Each day, Walter woke before the sun. No alarms, just habit. He would brew a pot of coffee strong enough to peel paint, then head outside with Max and Bravo flanking him like shadows. The dogs were like him, scarred, disciplined, and quiet. Max, the older of the two, had a silver streak down his snout and a limp from an IED blast in Kandahar. Bravo, younger, still moved like a ghost. Together they had tracked insurgents through desert heat and jungle canopy. They didn't bark, they assessed, they obeyed, they protected. Walter had trained them himself, back when he was stationed overseas, not for obedience like a pet, but for precision like a partner. These weren't animals, they were soldiers, and they were the only living things Walter trusted. On his land, he built them custom shelters, reinforced with steel frames. Every command they knew was a blend of English, German, and hand signals. He never had to shout, just a flick of the fingers, and they moved like wind. The town never knew about any of this. To them, he was the recluse who never came to town meetings, the one who once told a city councilman to get off my property and slammed the door in his face. He didn't fit the mold of the polite retiree with a lawnmower and a porch flag. He didn't smile politely when people asked stupid questions like, "You ever shoot anyone?" And when teenagers drove past his gate at night just to yell insults, he didn't react. He'd seen worse, much worse. But something had shifted lately. A few new officers in town, fresh faces with too much attitude and not enough respect. They didn't know Walter, didn't care who he was. And when they caught glimpses of Max and Bravo during patrols, tactical vests, military patches, drills happening at dawn, they didn't ask questions. They made assumptions. Whispers turned into calls, calls turned into concerned citizen reports. And in a town like this, that was all it took for trouble to start brewing. Still, Walter didn't flinch. He had survived ambushes in foreign deserts, corruption in command ranks, and the slow disintegration of every bone in his body from years of service. A few local cops with nothing better to do weren't going to shake him. But what he didn't know yet was that this time they weren't just going to drive by and gawk. This time they were going to test him, push him, try to break him. And when they did, they'd discover something that no academy had prepared them for. You don't mock a warrior who's already buried more brothers than you'll ever have friends. And you never, ever step onto the land of a man whose best friends are trained to kill with a whisper. The day started like every other. The sun had just begun to rise above the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the frost-kissed grass. Walter had already completed his morning stretch and poured kibble into Max and Bravo's bowls. As they ate in silence, he walked the perimeter of his property with a steaming mug of black coffee, taking mental notes of repairs he wanted to get done before summer. He moved slowly, not out of weakness but deliberation, every step measured, every thought precise. That kind of discipline never left a man, even decades after the battlefield. By mid-morning he was bent over in his garden, sleeves rolled up, coaxing new life out of the soil he'd come to love more than any city, more than any medals or folded flags. It was in that quiet, almost sacred moment, kneeling in the dirt with the hum of bees and the occasional bark in the distance, that the sound of tires crunching gravel broke through the peace like a blade slicing fabric. Walter didn't look up immediately. He set his trowel aside, wiped his hands on a rag, and took a slow breath. 3 cruisers, then 4, then 5. Engines still running, lights flashing. No sirens, no announcements, just presence. He stood, back straight, and stared down the narrow road leading to his front gate. It was more than obvious that this wasn't a traffic stop or a friendly visit. This was a show of force, small-town intimidation packaged as protocol. He didn't recognize the officers at first, new hires from out of town most likely, young, eager, wearing vests like armor and sunglasses to hide their inexperience, the kind who hadn't yet learned the difference between control and power. They stepped out of their vehicles with a kind of swagger Walter had seen before, young men playing soldier. One of them even adjusted his belt like he was preparing for a showdown. Another had his hand resting lightly on the butt of his holstered weapon. Walter raised one eyebrow, then turned back toward the house. Not quickly, not in retreat, but with the same calm he'd had walking away from firefights overseas. He knew the dogs would be watching through the screen door, waiting for a signal. The officers didn't announce themselves. They just stood there at the edge of the driveway, like wolves pretending to be sheepdogs. Finally, one of them, slightly older, clearly in charge, called out, "Hey you! We've had reports of suspicious activity on this property. We need to ask you a few questions." The way he said it, suspicious activity, made it sound more like a threat than a concern. Walter didn't answer right away. He knew the game. Vague accusations, no warrant, hoping he'd panic or get defensive. He'd seen it too many times on the news, and even more in real life when he wore the uniform. Instead, he took one slow step toward the fence and said evenly, "What kind of suspicious activity?" His voice didn't crack or quiver. It was calm, practiced. The kind of voice you'd only hear from someone who had been trained to stay alive in chaos. The lead officer smirked and motioned toward the others. Multiple calls, people saying they saw military gear, dogs trained to attack, maybe even weapons on site. "We need to make sure everything's safe." That last word came out like a joke. Walter could see it in his eyes. This wasn't about public safety. It was about humiliation, a test of submission. Still, Walter kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed. "And where's your warrant?" The smirk faded just slightly. The officer stepped forward. "Don't need one if we've got reasonable suspicion." Behind him, another officer pulled a phone from his pocket and began recording video. Walter couldn't help but chuckle softly, just once. They thought they were building a case, creating their version of a story they thought would never be challenged. He knew better. As they started spreading out, circling the property like a tactical unit, Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg, he didn't threaten. He simply turned his head and whistled once, a sharp, distinct tone that cut through the air like a command on a battlefield. The officers paused, confused for a second, and then they heard it, the low, steady thud of paws on wood. Something was coming, something they weren't ready for. The first insult came casually, tossed like a stone into still water, meant to cause ripples. One of the younger officers, barely out of academy by the looks of him, nodded toward Walter's boots and muttered under his breath, "What's this guy think he is, some kind of Rambo? He probably bought those patches online." Another laughed. "Look at him, bent over a tomato patch like it's a minefield. He's just a lonely old man with too much time and too many conspiracy theories." The others chuckled, emboldened by the absence of any real threat. To them, Walter wasn't dangerous. He was a caricature, a stereotype, an old man clinging to glory days that probably never happened. And the more they laughed, the more they believed it. Walter heard it all, every word. He didn't flinch. He'd been mocked before, by politicians who used soldiers for speeches and then forgot their names, by bureaucrats who denied him claims for injuries they never had the courage to earn, and even by civilians who thanked him for his service without understanding what that service cost. These officers weren't the first to doubt him, and they wouldn't be the last. What bothered him wasn't the disrespect. It was the arrogance. the ease with which they dismissed decades of sacrifice because he wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. The lead officer, cocky and condescending, took a few steps forward, closing the gap between them. "Tell me something, Mr. Briggs," he said, voice thick with sarcasm. "You really expect us to believe you were in the military? Let me guess, Special Forces, right? Probably ran Black Ops for the Pentagon, yeah?" He gave a theatrical wink to one of the younger officers. "Or maybe you just watch too many action movies." Walter's hands stayed at his sides, calloused fingers twitching slightly from the tension building in his knuckles. He didn't need to prove anything. His life had already been proof. His spine had metal in it. His right shoulder had been rebuilt after shrapnel ripped through it. His lungs had scarring from a chemical fire that burned for 2 days, while his team held a perimeter no one else could reach in time. He bore the evidence in his bones, not on his walls. The officer leaned closer, his voice lowering into something meant to provoke. "You know, people like you are dangerous. Old men with soldier fantasies. You think you still matter, but you don't. You're just in the way." The words hit harder than he expected, not because they hurt, but because they rang with a cruel honesty about how some in the world saw him now. Disposable, redundant, a relic. But Walter didn't lash out. He'd learned long ago that anger was a weapon often used against its owner. Instead, he spoke with a kind of quiet authority that unsettled the group more than shouting ever could. "I've buried men who never got the chance to be old and disrespected," he said. "And I've seen boys like you cry for their mothers when reality finally catches up to their ego. So before you talk about danger, ask yourself, what kind of man mocks someone who's already paid your debt?" For a moment there was silence. Real silence. The kind that hovers just after truth has been spoken. The officer shifted slightly, unsure how to respond. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially when inflated by a badge and an audience, so he doubled down. "Yeah, okay, Grandpa. Tell it to someone who cares. You've got 2 mutts and a camo vest. Big deal. That doesn't make you a hero. Just makes you look paranoid." He turned to the others. "Let's take a look around. Maybe we'll find some of those classified missions he never went on." Walter watched them start to move, spreading out across his land like scavengers. One kicked over a watering can without looking. Another stepped into the garden, trampling the very soil Walter had spent months turning fertile again. Their laughter returned, louder now, bolder, fueled by the belief that they held all the power. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that they were standing on land protected by instincts far sharper than their arrogance. And in the next few moments, they were going to learn the difference between an old man and a trained warrior, between dogs and soldiers, between disrespect and a mistake you don't get the chance to make twice. The gate creaked slightly in the breeze as one officer stepped past the property line, his boot grinding into the dirt path like he owned the place. Another walked toward the shed, uninvited and unconcerned, lifting the latch without hesitation. Walter's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Not yet. His eyes followed every step, every motion, reading their body language like a second language, one learned over years of battlefield standoffs. He'd seen this dance before, uniforms acting without accountability, treating private land like enemy terrain, believing that intimidation would somehow substitute for authority. But they didn't know what line they were crossing, not just legally, but morally. The lead officer remained front and center, a smug expression fixed on his face as if daring Walter to challenge him. "This your shed?" he asked, even as his men were already halfway through it. "Looks like a good place to hide something. Maybe weapons, drugs, military gear you're not supposed to have?" He said it casually, like they weren't trespassing, like they weren't poking around a veteran's personal life without cause. Walter folded his arms. "You're violating federal law," he said, calm but deliberate. "No warrant, no probable cause. You're not investigators right now. You're trespassers." The officer laughed under his breath. "You think throwing big words around is going to stop us? You watch too many courtroom dramas, old man. We don't need a warrant if there's reasonable suspicion, and you've given us plenty." He looked Walter up and down, eyes lingering on the insignia patch still stitched to the edge of the porch banner. Military dogs, restricted gear, reclusive behavior, and, let's be honest, you don't exactly scream stable. That's probable cause enough in this town. Another officer emerged from the shed holding a dusty tool case, shaking it like it might rattle loose some hidden contraband. "Nothing in here but rust and regrets," he muttered, tossing it aside with a loud clatter. Another slammed a cupboard door shut, knocking loose a line of hanging cords Walter had organized just days before. The small, meticulous order of his world was being dismantled piece by piece, not because they expected to find anything, but because they wanted him to break. They wanted anger, they wanted resistance, they wanted something to justify the invasion. Walter knew the tactic well. It was the same game corrupt officials played in unstable war zones. Provoke until a reaction gave them permission to escalate. He saw it in the way one officer deliberately stepped through his vegetable rows, crushing seedlings underfoot, then smiling as he wiped his boot on the grass. He saw it when another opened the back door to his barn, calling out, "Hey, what's this? You hiding people back here or just ghosts from your imaginary missions?" Still, Walter didn't react, but beneath the surface his mind was racing. This wasn't random. This wasn't some patrol that went too far. Someone had made a call, someone with influence, someone who either didn't believe in his past, or worse, knew exactly who he was and wanted him silenced. His heart beat slower, not faster, as adrenaline settled into his system like an old friend. His breaths were even, focused. A lifetime of training clicked into place, instincts sharpened not by paranoia, but by survival. And yet even now he gave them a chance to walk away. "You've made your point," he said, voice low but cutting through the morning air like a knife. "But unless you want your names on a federal complaint, I suggest you get off my land. Now." The lead officer just grinned and took another step forward until they were almost nose to nose. "Or what? You gonna sick your war dogs on us? Give us a good reason to put you down?" He made a show of unfastening the strap over his holster, fingers just shy of drawing. The others watched closely, waiting. They thought they had control, thought they were the wolves here, but Walter wasn't prey. With one simple flick of his wrist, almost too fast to notice, he tapped a tiny button on his belt. The frequency it triggered was silent to human ears, but not to the two forces that had been waiting inside the house, tense, alert, and patient. They had seen enough. They had waited long enough. Max and Bravo were no longer in rest mode. The next time those officers looked toward the porch, they would understand what it meant to be outmatched, not by firepower, but by discipline, precision, and a level of training that couldn't be faked or bought. In that final breath of arrogance, they still thought they were in control. That illusion was about to shatter. The officer at the shed kicked the door open harder than necessary, the hinges shrieking in protest, as if the structure itself objected to being violated. Dust floated through the morning light, swirling like ghosts disturbed from their rest. Inside, he began rifling through Walter's neatly arranged tools, opening containers, flipping through supply bins, knocking things over without care. Another officer, the one who had crushed the seedlings in the garden, yanked open the lid of a storage crate and dumped its contents onto the ground. Gloves, ropes, old harnesses, grinning as if expecting something illegal to tumble out with them. But nothing came. No weapons, no contraband. Just the personal belongings of a man who had spent years trying to build something peaceful in the aftermath of war. The officer who had led the group stood inches from Walter, his mouth twisted into a satisfied smirk, like he was just waiting for the moment when the old man snapped. His hand hovered closer now to his holstered weapon, using body language he probably thought was subtle. Walter saw it clearly, saw through it. This wasn't law enforcement, this was posturing. Psychological chess played with half-trained rookies who thought intimidation was a skill. He'd seen that stance in warlords, corrupt border guards, and inexperienced mercenaries who didn't yet understand the consequences of a wrong move. The officers weren't talking anymore, they were acting. One bent down and picked up a rusted army footlocker and shook it violently, hoping something incriminating might fall out. Another officer moved toward the back door of Walter's house, fingers brushing his radio. "We should check inside," he said over his shoulder. "Could be more in there." Walter turned slightly to intercept his view and took a measured step forward. "You crossed that threshold without a warrant," he said, "and the consequences will be yours to live with, if you live at all." The officer hesitated, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. There was something in Walter's voice that didn't sound like a bluff. It didn't sound like anger. It sounded like truth, cool, practiced, and unafraid. But the lead officer wasn't ready to back down. Not now. His pride was on the line. He turned toward his men. "Keep looking. Old man's hiding something. I can feel it." Another crash echoed from the side of the barn as something metallic hit the concrete floor, followed by laughter. One officer had overturned a storage shelf and sent cans of screws and bolts spilling everywhere. "Maybe the weapons are buried in this mess," he joked, kicking at the debris like a child throwing a tantrum. Yet another trampled through a section of garden that Walter had spent weeks cultivating. Boot prints now dug deep into the rows of tomatoes and squash, leaves crushed under his heels. It was no longer just a search, it was desecration, intentional, calculated. Walter didn't respond with threats. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. Instead, he watched, measured their movements, catalogued their actions. Every step they took across his land, every item they mishandled, every inch they invaded without justification. He logged it all, silently, not in fear, but in preparation. Because this wasn't chaos, it was evidence. Every action they took was building his case for what was to come. One officer picked up a photo frame from a shelf near the porch and sneered. "Who's this, your old squad? Or just some actors from a movie?" He flipped it face down and tossed it on the porch, where it slid to a stop beside Walter's boot. Walter stared at it for a long moment. That photo had been taken 16 years ago, just hours after his unit had rescued a group of hostages from a remote compound overseas. 4 men in that photo were dead now, not from age, from sacrifice. That, more than the insults, more than the trespassing, more than the garden and the shed and the careless feet, that was the moment the last thread of tolerance left him. He crouched down, picked up the frame, brushed the dust off the glass, and returned it to its place. Then he stood tall, shoulders squaring, spine straightening to its full height. And for the first time that morning he gave a signal, not to the men on his property, but to the ones waiting behind his door. His voice was calm but resolute. "Max, Bravo, deploy." The officers didn't understand the weight of those words at first. They looked around, puzzled, as if expecting backup or some kind of protest. What they heard instead was the unmistakable sound of claws on hardwood. 2 sets, rapid, controlled, heavy enough to be heard but not frantic. Then the door creaked open, slowly, precisely, and out they came. Max first, older, grizzled, with eyes like burnished bronze and a jawline that had once clamped down on a would-be suicide bomber before he could reach a convoy. Bravo followed, sleeker, black-coated, quiet as a shadow and just as deadly. Both wore black tactical vests, faded but unmistakable, patches still intact. Their pace was unhurried, their formation tight, their eyes fixed not on Walter, but on the officers who had dared invade their ground. The air changed. Not a single bark, not a growl, no snarling or snapping, just complete silence and calculated presence. The kind of presence that triggers a response in your gut before your mind can catch up. The kind that warns something's wrong and you might not walk away from it. Suddenly, the mockery was gone. The laughter stopped. The cocky smirks were replaced by stiffened shoulders, shallow breaths, widened eyes. One officer's hand began inching toward his holster again, but the moment he did, Max shifted his weight and took one step forward, not aggressive, not reckless, but with such silent intent that the officer froze mid-motion. Walter stood still, arms folded, not needing to say a word. He had warned them, repeatedly. He had given them every chance to walk away, but pride had cost them perspective. Now they were surrounded, not by weapons, not by bullets, but by something far more precise. Max and Bravo weren't just dogs. They were trained military assets, capable of assessing threats and executing non-lethal takedowns in under 3 seconds, and they never made mistakes. The officers were finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. but understanding it didn't mean they could undo it. Because now it was no longer about a search gone too far. Now it was about control, and for the first time that morning they realized they didn't have it. The ground seemed to still beneath their boots as Max and Bravo advanced, not with speed, but with unwavering focus. These were not guard dogs reacting out of fear or noise or adrenaline. These were soldiers, disciplined, deadly, deliberate. They moved in a classic two-man flanking formation, one to the right, one to the left, eyes scanning, weight evenly distributed over each step. Their breathing was controlled, barely audible, yet their presence commanded the entire space. The officers, who just moments ago had been laughing, stomping and mocking, now stood rooted in place, hands uncertain, voices caught somewhere between false authority and genuine fear. One officer whispered under his breath, "What are they doing?" as if speaking louder might provoke a response. But Walter knew better. Max and Bravo weren't interested in noise. They were reading posture, intent, heartbeat. Bravo's ears tilted ever so slightly as he calculated the position of each target, while Max kept his gaze on the lead officer, the one who had stepped closest to Walter, the one who had crossed the final boundary with arrogance instead of a badge. The man tried to reassert dominance, tried to speak with a voice that sounded far less confident than before. "Control your animals," he barked, but the bark was hollow. Walter didn't respond to the demand. He responded to the tension in the air, the delicate moment where fear meets consequence. He lifted one hand and made a tiny circular motion with his index finger. The dogs immediately halted their advance, locking into position like statues forged from instinct and years of field training. Bravo's eyes didn't blink. Max didn't breathe, not visibly at least, but every muscle was alive, ready, waiting for the next cue. The lead officer swallowed hard, sweat now visible just beneath his temple. His fingers twitched near his holster again, but he didn't draw. Something deep in his nervous system was overriding his bravado now. The training he'd received at the academy, whatever it had been, was crumbling under the weight of real-world authority, the kind earned in shadows and silence, not through paperwork and uniforms. Walter finally spoke, his voice measured and without emotion. Max and Bravo were trained by Special Operations. Each one has over 2,000 hours of combat fieldwork. They've taken down armed insurgents in pitch-black conditions. They've neutralized threats inside bombed-out buildings, in crowded marketplaces, even on moving targets. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but because every word he said was simply fact. They don't bark. They don't growl. They don't need to. They've been trained to eliminate threats before the threats realize what's happening. If either of them had decided you were a danger, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He let that truth hang in the air for a moment, not as a threat but as reality. Reality the officers were only now beginning to grasp. One of the younger cops, the one who'd flipped the photo earlier, took a step back and bumped into another officer. "I think we're out of line," he muttered, but it was too late to save face. The damage had been done, the house had been invaded, the land trampled, the service disrespected, but worst of all for these men, the illusion that they had control had been shattered completely. Bravo shifted his weight again and stared down an officer near the garden, who had just stepped back into the path he'd crushed earlier. The officer froze, his mouth open, eyes wide, as if expecting an attack, but Bravo didn't move, just watched and waited. Behind the dogs, Walter remained motionless. His presence alone was a counterbalance to the chaos, a steady force holding the tension together like the fulcrum in a scale. Another officer finally spoke. "Sir," he said, voice strained, "we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just following up on a report." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. Reports, probable cause, suspicion. None of those things justified what they had done. And the presence of those dogs made one thing unmistakably clear. They weren't the ones with the power anymore. Walter slowly raised his other hand and gave a downward gesture. Both dogs relaxed their posture slightly, stepping back into a neutral stance, still alert, still watching, but no longer on the edge of action. The moment was not diffused, it was simply on pause, a warning delivered and understood. The lead officer's jaw tightened, face flushed with a mix of fear and indignation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. But he wasn't stupid, not entirely. He knew when the upper hand had been lost. Still, pride is a heavy weight, and rather than admit fault, he tried to recover some semblance of control. He sneered and said, "Fine, you've made your point. You trained some dogs. But this doesn't change the fact that we're within our rights to be here." Walter tilted his head slightly, not angry, not impressed, just disappointed. "The only thing you're within," he said, "is a lawsuit and a career-ending complaint. And if you keep pushing, it'll be worse than that." In the distance, tires crunched again, another car approaching. But this one didn't belong to law enforcement. Walter didn't turn. He already knew who it was. He had triggered the alert long before the first officer set foot on his property. The same system that brought Max and Bravo out on command had also sent a silent message to his lawyer, to a journalist contact, and to a handful of local allies who still believed in integrity. Because Walter didn't just prepare for confrontation, he prepared for consequences. The officers were now caught between a rock and a story that was quickly unraveling beyond their control. A veteran who hadn't flinched, two military dogs who could take them down without hesitation. And now, witnesses arriving, one after the other, ensuring that whatever had begun here wouldn't stay hidden for long. Max and Bravo returned to Walter's side and sat in perfect unison, their gaze never leaving the intruders. And as the officers looked at those animals, calm, precise, terrifying in their discipline, they understood what Walter had meant. This wasn't about ego, it was about control, earned through sacrifice, respect built from blood, and presence, enforced not with threats, but with certainty. The kind of certainty you only earn after walking through hell and coming back standing, and now they were standing on his ground. For a few moments, no one moved. The officers stood surrounded by silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind that made your skin itch. The kind that filled the lungs like smoke just before a fire reveals itself. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of disturbed soil and sweat and something else, something heavier, embarrassment, regret. The realization that everything they thought they controlled had slipped away from them the second those dogs had stepped forward. Their training hadn't prepared them for this. No one at the academy had taught them what to do when arrogance collided with professionalism, so disciplined it felt otherworldly. They were still holding their weapons. They still had the badges, the radios, the cruisers parked at odd angles along Walter's gravel drive. But none of it mattered, because they knew, deep in the part of the mind where truth lives, that if Max and Bravo had moved forward instead of halting, no one would have stopped them. Not in time. Not with the tools they had. The lead officer tried to shake off the weight of the moment by straightening his shoulders, puffing out his chest just a little, as if posture could reassert dominance. "You think this little demonstration scares us?" he said, though his voice didn't carry the conviction it had earlier. "We've dealt with aggressive dogs before." One of the other officers shot him a look, one he tried to hide, but it was obvious. "No, we haven't. Not like this. These weren't aggressive dogs. These were trained assets, federal level. Their behavior wasn't erratic. It was calculated. Their stillness wasn't submission. It was control." Walter didn't blink. He didn't need to respond. Every second that passed was a lesson. And the officers were the students, not by choice, but by consequence. Max's eyes remained locked on the lead officer, not blinking, not moving, just studying him like a threat still being evaluated. Bravo sat stone still, but the tension in his body spoke volumes. He was a coiled spring, still reading the perimeter, still monitoring every angle. His ears twitched at the sound of boots shifting, even before the men realized they had moved. Finally, the youngest of the group, no older than 24, shifted his weight and muttered to the officer beside him, "We shouldn't be here." It wasn't defiance, it was instinct, the kind that bubbles to the surface when training fails and all that's left is raw, human fear. The lead officer glared at him but said nothing, because deep down he felt it too. Walter took a single step forward, not aggressive, not hostile, just enough to draw their eyes. I've fought in 3 countries you've never heard of, slept under broken ceilings while mortars landed 100 yards away. I've led men into buildings knowing not all of them would walk back out. I trained Max and Bravo to survive because the difference between chaos and control is usually measured in seconds. They've found bodies under rubble before a rescue team even arrived, and they've ended threats faster than your department can respond to a call. He let the words hang there, not as a boast, as a reckoning. Another officer, this one older, more seasoned, finally broke the silence with a question he should have asked from the beginning. "Who exactly are you?" His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It was cautious, measured, maybe even a little apologetic. Walter turned his head slightly, just enough to let the sunlight catch the edge of the faded unit patch sewn onto Max's vest. It was a mark few outside of the military would recognize, but to those who knew, it was a warning, not just of service, but of a level of clearance and capability that wasn't public. "I'm a man who earned his peace," Walter said, "and I'll defend it, legally, decisively, and without apology." The lead officer started to speak, but Walter cut him off with nothing more than a raised hand. "You've made your entrance. You've trampled my land. You've mocked my service and tried to provoke a response. You've recorded, poked, and searched. But what you haven't done is present a warrant. You haven't justified a single footstep on this property. So I suggest you ask yourselves, what happens next when the person you tried to corner was never in a corner to begin with?" Just then, the sound of another vehicle pulling in caught everyone's attention. Tires on gravel again, but slower this time, deliberate. Heads turned. A white SUV rolled to a stop just outside the property line. The logo on the side read County Civil Oversight Commission. The door opened, and a woman in business attire stepped out with a clipboard and an unimpressed expression. "Got a tip about a possible unauthorized search at a veteran's property," she said aloud, her voice clear and crisp. "And judging by the scene, I'd say the tip was well-founded." The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The officer who had once laughed about tomato plants and Rambo delusions was now backing away from the shed, brushing dirt off his pants and avoiding eye contact. The oversight representative's gaze swept across the group, pausing at the dogs, then at Walter, and finally at the garden where boot prints still scarred the soil. "This property is under private ownership. These animals are marked as federal trained assets. I'd like to see a warrant. Now." The silence that followed was the kind that seals fate. The lead officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew the truth. And for the first time that morning, Walter allowed a flicker of expression to cross his face. Not a smile, something quieter. The expression of a man who had held his ground. Not with violence, not with rage, but with preparation, patience, and 2 loyal shadows trained to enforce peace by standing still until called into the storm. Max shifted his weight slightly and sat. Bravo licked his lips once, then relaxed his shoulders. The threat was over, but the lesson would remain. Because long after the officers left, and long after the reports were filed and reviewed and buried or exposed, one thing would linger in their memories more than anything else. It wasn't the whistle. It wasn't the warning. It was the way 2 dogs walked out of a quiet house and reminded 6 armed men what real discipline looks like. Walter didn't move from where he stood. He didn't need to. Max and Bravo had already redrawn the lines of control, and every man standing on his property now knew it. The illusion of dominance the officers had clung to, bolstered by flashing lights, polished badges and tightened vests, had been dismantled by 2 dogs who hadn't so much as growled. The weight of the silence was now theirs to carry, and in that silence Walter's voice finally broke through, calm, even, precise. "They're not pets," he said, "they're partners." His tone wasn't raised, yet each syllable landed like a gavel striking oak. Max was with me in Helmand Province, took shrapnel to the leg and still dragged a wounded man 50 yards out of a hot zone before collapsing. Bravo's younger, but smarter than most men I've served with, tracked a high-value target across 4 kilometers of mountainous terrain in pitch darkness. Never lost the trail. Both of them were declared too valuable to release, too dangerous to retire, but I fought to bring them home. Not because I needed them, but because they needed a place where their loyalty wasn't a weapon, just a bond. He looked down at them. Max still sat at attention, Bravo mirroring him. No tension, just readiness. Years of training held in place by a single gesture. These two didn't come from a shelter, they came from war. They've disarmed gunmen, located explosives under crumbling bridges, and intercepted suicide bombers at checkpoints. They're trained to assess threat posture based on your movement, your voice, your blood pressure. You blink wrong and they'll know before your finger hits the trigger. You step wrong and it's over before you take a breath. The officers listened, but not because they were told to. They listened because they had no choice. The control of the scene had shifted irrevocably. Walter didn't need reinforcements. He didn't need to shout or argue. He simply stood, with history at his back and discipline at his side. Every word he spoke peeled back the illusion these men had of their authority, reminding them that the symbols stitched to their sleeves did not make them infallible. "They aren't here to scare you," Walter continued. "They're here because I don't go anywhere without them. Not because I'm afraid, but because we made a promise. Out there," he said, gesturing to the invisible war zones that still lived in his memory. "They kept me alive. Here, I give them peace. That was the deal. But don't mistake that peace for weakness." The oversight officer who had just arrived remained quiet, taking notes but watching closely. She had seen enough to understand the dynamics without needing the full context. And from the way she glanced at Max's vest, she understood more than most. The patches on the side weren't for show. They were authentic, issued under a command code that only certain branches even had access to. These weren't tactical Halloween costumes or Amazon knockoffs. These were federally tracked Department of Defense registered identifiers, and any harm toward either of them could trigger a federal response. That alone should have been reason enough for the officers to turn around and leave. But their hesitation now wasn't just about legality. It was about dignity, what little they had left. One officer, clearly shaken, stepped back from the porch. He looked down at the crushed tomato plants, at the scattered tools from the shed, and then back at Walter. "We didn't mean to cross a line," he said, voice barely audible. "We were just told to check things out. It got out of hand." Walter didn't look at him. It always gets out of hand when people forget what they're really here to protect. Then he turned toward the lead officer. "You thought you were coming up here to deal with a cranky old man and his backyard guard dogs. You thought this would be easy, humiliate me, provoke a reaction, twist it around so I'd look unstable. I've seen this tactic in too many countries, different uniforms, same plan." The officer said nothing. His jaw was set, but the bravado had withered. The authority he wielded like a blunt instrument had slipped from his grip the moment Max took a single step forward. There was no salvaging what had been lost. Not the moment, not the credibility, not the upper hand. Walter crouched down slowly, placing one hand on Bravo's shoulder. The dog's ears flicked once, acknowledging the touch but never breaking his gaze. Walter spoke quietly, but not just to Bravo. His voice carried for all of them to hear. "Stand down, soldier. Situation contained." The effect was immediate. Bravo's body relaxed slightly, his stance easing into that of a loyal companion rather than an active combatant. Max mirrored him, shifting just enough to signal calm. And yet their eyes never left the officers. They didn't need a reason to attack, they needed a reason to not. Walter stood again. "You came here with the intent to find something you could use against me. You leave now with nothing but the truth. I'm not your enemy. But if you come onto my land again without legal authority, you'll find out that my restraint today was a courtesy, not a habit." It was only then, that the officers began stepping back, retreating in awkward silence toward their cruisers. No one spoke. No one gave orders. The moment had shattered their coordination. There would be no formal exit, no sirens, just the sound of doors opening and engines rumbling as they drove away, a little slower, a little smaller than when they had arrived. And as they disappeared down the road, Walter remained still, standing between the porch and his dogs, like a soldier who had never really left the field. The land was quiet again, but the message had been sent. Respect wasn't owed because of a badge or a title. It was earned by action, by history, and by the quiet presence of two animals who had seen more war than the men they had just faced. No threats, no violence, just discipline, steel, and the unshakable bond between a soldier and the only beings who had ever understood what that meant. The quiet that settled over Walter's land after the cruisers disappeared was not relief, it was confirmation. Confirmation that he had been tested again and had held the line without bending. Max and Bravo remained seated at his side, still watching the path long after the last of the taillights vanished behind the curve of the trees. Walter didn't call them off yet. He knew better. Too many times in his life the threat hadn't ended when the guns were lowered or the boots retreated. Sometimes the danger only circled back in a new form. He walked slowly toward the edge of the porch, pausing by the ruined edge of the garden. His eyes passed over the crushed tomato vines, the trampled lettuce rows, the snapped irrigation line that now lay in a jagged arc across the soil. He didn't curse, didn't shake his head or sigh. He just observed, like a scout surveying a battlefield after the smoke clears. Each footprint in the dirt told a story. Every careless act was another line of evidence in a pattern of escalating intrusion. The damage wasn't just physical, it was a message, a test of how much he would endure before breaking, but they had failed to realize something crucial. He didn't break, he endured. Walter knelt near one of the tomato plants and pressed his hand gently into the earth. It was still warm beneath the surface, alive and holding on. He would replant, rebuild. He always did, because that's what warriors do after the storm passes. They count what's left and they begin again. That instinct didn't fade with age or injury or the stripes you no longer wore on your shoulder. It remained in your blood, in your posture, in the way your boots fell on familiar ground. Max let out a low huff behind him, just one breath, enough to say, "We're clear." Walter nodded and stood up, brushing his hands off on his jeans. Then, at last, he gave the release signal, 2 slow taps against his thigh. Instantly, both dogs relaxed, shaking off the tension like armor being removed. Bravo trotted over to the water bowl near the porch while Max stretched and sat near the threshold, his tail thudding once against the boards. The storm had passed for now, but Walter knew the calm wouldn't last. Inside the house, he removed his boots, set them in their usual place by the door, and walked to his desk where a small black box sat closed. It wasn't large, about the size of a book, but inside was a flash drive, a portable hard drive, and a worn field notebook. These weren't souvenirs, they were a backup plan. Documentation of everything that had happened since he retired, encounters, surveillance camera footage, even voice recordings of past altercations with authorities who had crossed the line. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparedness, the same kind that had kept him alive in Kabul, Fallujah, and a dozen other places whose names he never spoke unless asked directly. He slid open the drawer beneath the box and added a small note card. June 17th, 5 patrol units, no warrant, entered shed, trampled crops, provoked response, dogs deployed, no injuries. Then he slipped the card into the notebook with the others. He didn't need to relive these moments, but someone might. If ever there was a day when he couldn't speak for himself, this record would. Outside, the sun had begun to dip lower on the horizon. The long shadows of the pines reached farther across the field, draping the land in gold and grey. Walter stepped back onto the porch and leaned against the support beam, watching as Max padded silently to his usual post at the corner of the deck. Bravo lay nearby, head resting on his front paws, eyes still scanning the tree line, even as they narrowed with fatigue. And then, slowly, the neighborhood began to stir, not with noise or chaos, but with subtle signs that others had seen. A neighbor from 3 parcels over drove past a little slower than usual. Another, an older couple in a rusted red pickup, gave Walter a single nod as they passed. Not everyone in town had turned a blind eye. Some had just been waiting, watching, hoping someone else would stand first. Now that someone had, Their silence seemed a little less necessary. An hour passed, then a knock on the gate. Walter turned his head and saw a young man, late 20s, jeans dusty, boots worn, standing just beyond the line. He looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Briggs," he called. "Name's Caleb. I live down off the East Road. I saw what happened. Saw them surround your place. I didn't call them, just wanted you to know." Walter said nothing at first, just stared. Caleb continued. "They came by my place 2 weeks ago, asked questions, weird questions, about who visits, what we've seen. Thought it was just routine until I saw what they did here." He glanced at the gate, then back at Walter. "You ain't the only one they've tried to push, but you're the first one that made them back off." Walter studied him for a moment longer, then gave a single nod. Nothing more, and that was enough. Caleb nodded back and walked off, the weight of gratitude in every step. When Walter turned back to his house, he didn't feel vindicated. He felt something quieter. He felt the beginning of a shift, not in the town, not yet, but in the silence that followed injustice. There were eyes watching now, but not in fear, in awareness, in awakening. What those officers tried to do wasn't new. It was old, repeated, polished into a routine that had probably worked 100 times before. But today it didn't, because today they met a man who had already stared down death too many times to be moved by ego, a man who walked not with pride but with purpose, a man who didn't need anyone to believe his past, because the truth walked beside him in the form of two animals who were trained not to prove but to protect. Max stirred as dusk fell. Bravo yawned, then stood and paced once along the edge of the porch. The day was ending, but Walter knew better than to think the battle was over. The next time might come in a different shape, a different name, a different badge, but he would be ready, because some men don't live on edge out of fear. They live there because that's where the watch is kept. As the sun finally dipped behind the ridgeline and cast the last of its amber light across the fields, Walter sat on the edge of his porch in silence, Max's head resting near his boot. Bravo curled a few feet away in a half-alert doze. The light breeze stirred the long grass just beyond the garden, and in the deepening quiet it sounded like whispers, soft, subtle reminders that everything had changed, and yet nothing had. The officers were gone, the false accusations hadn't stuck, and no warrant had ever materialized. But Walter knew better than to count the victory too soon. Men like that didn't lose well. They nursed humiliation like a wound, and wounds like that had a way of festering into vengeance. He'd seen it before. Not on foreign battlefields, but right here on American soil, when pride met resistance and turned into retaliation. When systems built on unchecked power mistook silence for surrender and were shocked to find out that some people don't just survive pressure, they sharpen under it. Walter had held the line that day, but he knew they'd be back. Maybe not the same officers, maybe not with sirens and lights. Maybe next time it would be legal notices, inspections, bureaucratic tricks designed to chip away at his freedom in quieter, more insidious ways. That's how it worked. First, they tried to break your body. Then they tried to bury you in paper. But they hadn't counted on the network. Not just Max and Bravo, not just Walter's meticulous records and security systems, but the people, the ones who'd stayed silent too long. The ones who, after watching those cruisers roll up and surround a man who had never once asked for attention, realized that his fight might soon be their own. By morning the phone calls had begun, quiet ones. A neighbor who used to avoid eye contact left a voicemail offering to help repair the irrigation line. Another, someone Walter hadn't spoken to in over a year, left a small bag of fresh vegetables on the porch with a simple note, "Not all of us have forgotten." That was how resistance grew. Not in anger, not in chaos, but in awareness, in connection. The footage from Walter's security cameras had already been sent to multiple places. To his lawyer, to an independent media outlet he trusted, and to a veteran advocacy group that had offered assistance after a similar incident in another town. There was power in preparedness, but there was greater power in truth made visible. The images spoke for themselves. Officers walking onto private land with no legal standing, mocking a veteran, damaging property, provoking a man whose only crime was solitude, and then the change. the moment when Max and Bravo stepped out and rewrote the story with presence alone. Walter didn't need to tell the world what happened. He just needed them to see it, and they would. As night took over and the last traces of sunlight disappeared, Walter rose from the porch and gave a quiet hand signal. The dog stood and followed without hesitation. Inside, he moved through the house with the comfort of muscle memory, locking doors, checking windows, flicking off switches with the same pattern he'd used for years. He didn't live in fear, he lived in readiness, the kind honed not from paranoia but from experience. Because when you've walked through enough fire, you stop hoping it won't return. You just make sure you're not holding anything flammable when it does. Later that night, Walter sat at the dining table, the same table he'd built himself when he first bought the land. Spread out before him were maps, not of battlefields or terrain, but of his town. Property lines, zoning permits, historical deeds, a different kind of battlefield, but a battlefield all the same. He wasn't just planning for his defense anymore, he was preparing to go on the offensive, not with bullets, but with facts, with paperwork, with filings, with quiet leverage. He circled properties adjacent to his, ones that had been under pressure lately. He marked incidents he'd heard about from neighbors, strange visitors asking questions, code inspections that showed up with no notice, zoning notices that seemed to target only a specific type of landowner. It was a pattern. It always was. You just had to know how to see it. He flipped open a small notebook and jotted down a name he hadn't written before, Sheriff Barnes. The man had stayed quiet during all this, too quiet. And in Walter's experience, silence wasn't always neutrality. Sometimes it was complicity, sometimes it was fear. But either way, it meant someone knew more than they were letting on. Walter would find out what. He always did. The next morning came like any other. Crisp air, dew on the grass, birdsong in the trees. But something had shifted. The mailbox held 3 envelopes, 2 bills and 1 unmarked letter. Inside was a photo, a picture taken from a distance, of Walter, on his porch. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable. No note, no sender, just the message that someone was watching. Walter stared at it for a long moment. Then he folded the photo, walked inside, and slid it into the same box that held his flash drives and notebook. Not because he was afraid, because it was evidence, and every piece mattered now. Later that day, a local journalist stopped by. Not a national face, just a young woman from the county paper who had heard something and wanted to know more. She didn't push, she just asked, "Why do you think they came for you?" Walter stared out over his land and thought about it. Then he answered, "Because they thought I was alone." She paused, then asked, "And you're not?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." Max sat beside him. Bravo stood behind. Somewhere down the road someone else was watching, but that was fine. Let them watch, let them take notes. Because the next time they came, there wouldn't just be footage and reports. There would be a town watching back. There would be neighbors prepared. There would be questions asked and evidence gathered. And above all, there would be 2 dogs, silent, loyal, unshaken, waiting not to fight, but to defend. Because the war might be over for some men, but for others, the watch never ends.